we're really, even if we're not like numerically at the halfway point of the class, content-wise, we're in the middle of the class now. It seems like perspective was a separate topic, but really it is part of the beginning phase of the class where we're dealing with structure and proportion, and hopefully you can see how perspective was an extension of cross contour, but basically applied to objects that have straight lines, so usually man-made objects. So everything that we've been doing up until now has to do with getting the drawing on the paper with the right proportions, well structured. So it's the equivalent of like building a building. We're putting up all the rebar. We're basically putting the walls on and everything. Now we're moving towards surface and detail. Even the surface stuff we dealt with before, like contour, cross contour, perspective, those were structuring the surface. Now it's like we've got our building built and we're going to start putting the decorations, the wallpaper, the paint, all of that on. So everything we do from here on out is focused on putting surfaces onto the structures that we built. We don't forget everything that we've done up till now. We're still going to need to structure, build our drawings, and we should still be using all the processes that I've been teaching you to do that, the ways of looking I've been teaching you to do that, to help you do that. But now we're technically moving into like the second half of the subject matter here. And we're going to talk about value. That's the first thing we need to talk about. Value is just the perceived lightness or darkness of a color, and in our case we're just talking about grays. So 50% gray, well, let me explain percentage. There's an infinite number of values, but for our sake it's very helpful to talk about them in percentages. So we're normally starting from a white surface, so we'll say white is 0% gray. There's 0 value there. Black would be 100% gray. We've put as much value as possible on the paper. Now, different materials have a different range of possible darkness or lightness, like some paper not be all the way white. Pencils don't get as dark as the black that the ink on a printout or the pixels on my screen could make. Conte and charcoal get a darker black than the graphite does. So we're always understanding this relative to what our tools can accomplish. So 0% gray would be as light as our tools can get us, and 100% gray would be as dark as our tools can get us. What we're looking at here with the value scale is then steps of 10%. So they're even steps of 10% darker, 10% darker, 10% darker. That's the best way I have to describe this, is just in terms of visual distance. These are all equally distant from each other visually in terms of how much faster they get darker. So this is very useful for us when I'm communicating to you about your drawings, because you could maybe be doing a 30% gray and you need to make it darker. So I could say, well, you've got like 25-30% gray. It needs to get closer to 55-60% gray. It just gives us a way to refer to these things. Now, this is pretty arbitrary. There's any infinite number of grays, but this is a very helpful way to talk about it. This 50% gray is neutral gray, and that's what we properly call gray. Anything lighter than 50% is a tint of gray, so it'd be like adding white to neutral gray. And anything darker than 50% would be a shade of gray. So unlike what this popular author would have us believe, there's only 48 shades of gray in between 51 and 99, not 50 shades. Down here we have a gradient, which is where all the values slowly just blend. A lot of students call this shading or blending or fading. This is just a gradient, and I'll use that term over and over and over again in the class, that a lot of students have trouble rendering, and by rendering I just mean drawing in a gradient. We need to work, and I'm going to give you a number of assignments that just help you get better at drawing gradients, rendering gradients, to get those slow, smooth transitions between grays without these steps in between them. A gradient is just any increase or decrease in the magnitude of a property. Here we mean value. So a slow, steady increase of value from light to dark, or decrease from dark to light. One of the most important things to realize about value is that your mental perception of value is relative to the context that the value sits in. So if you look at like this block here and this block here, this one's going to look quite a bit darker, and this one's going to look quite a bit lighter. Same here. This will look darker. This will look lighter. These are the exact same thing. Guarantee I go in and click on Photoshop, they're the exact same thing. What's happening is this one is surrounded by a light value. Not white. You can see it's not white. It's about 5% gray maybe. But your brain doesn't do absolutes. It does relatives, and then it mistakenly translates them to absolutes. So it sees this as a whole heck of a lot darker than that. Your brain does that, darker than. It sees darker than, and then it mistakes that for dark. Down here it sees this is lighter than, and that mistakes it for light. And when it compares these two, it says, well, that's dark and that's light. This is lighter than that. No, not really. So you'll see this also affects the sense of space between the jumps on the value scale. Like here, it seems like this is pretty far away value-wise from black, whereas this, they almost look like the exact same thing. That flips down here where this looks quite a bit darker than this one, and it looks like it's a pretty good distance away from white, whereas this looks like it's almost the same thing. Those kind of perceptions about value are relative to context, and we need to be very aware of that. That means that while we're working on drawings with a lot of shading, you never want to finish one area all at once. You need to get value all over everywhere. If you're always working relative to the white of the paper, you're always going to think stuff is way darker than it really is. You need to get value everywhere so that you can see what the actual values are in relationship to each other, and slowly build your drawings up from light to dark, always working on the whole thing at once. When we're working on the drawing and creating these gradients, and there's going to be a number of assignments that have you practice this, especially the pressure scale gradient homework, we're trying to also attach the sense of pressure to what we're doing. So as you slowly push harder and harder and harder, you slowly like reach your hand further back into the paper, you'll get darker values. As you ease up on the pressure and move your hand away from the paper, you'll create the lighter values. So we need to get that, now translate this sense of pressure that we had when we were dealing with line weight, and translate that to creating value. Another problem that you're going to encounter, and I'm going to purposely make you encounter it. I could just give you black and white photos, but I want you to encounter it, because if you're drawing from objects like we would in an in-person class, you would have to deal with objects that are in color and not having the photograph translate to black and white for you. So when you're dealing with color, you got to understand that colors also have values, and that would just be like, if I took a black and white picture of, say, the color wheel, what gray would be left over? You'll see that yellow is a naturally very light value, purple and violet is a very naturally dark value, red and green are actually pretty much the exact same value. It's just the hue is the exact opposite, so they appear dramatically different to most people. For people like me, I'm red-green colorblind, so I'm very sensitive to temperature, how cold or warm something is, and I'm very sensitive to value, but that gets difficult for me in like a warm green like this. It's not a cool green like that. It's a warm green, and it shares the same value as the red. I don't have the normal cues that I'm used to seeing. But for those of you who really do see the dramatic differences in color, you might be a little bit more mistaken about the difference in value, and you'll see here that they're pretty much the same value. Like a yellow green and a yellow orange are going to be pretty similar as well. There's a problem though of just thinking, well, what if I take this picture and I turn it into black and white? In this picture, part of the composition, the success of the composition, is how the yellow and the blue catch our attention, and then how this box back here tends to stand out, this window behind him. When I look at it in color, I assume that this thing's actually a little bit brighter. It seems brighter to me, and then I assume that the yellows are really bright and the blue is really bright. And that they're like definitely brighter than the skin. When I turn it to black and white in a photograph, you'll see that the yellow is pretty much the same value as the skin for the most part, other than the highlights. You'll see that this thing up here is actually a little bit darker than the wall, and you'll see that the blue is pretty close to the value of the skin in the yellow. That it might look a little lighter because it's surrounded by dark, but overall it looks to be about the same value. We tend to think that blue, even if it's a light blue, is darker than yellow because we're used to this setup of yellow being lighter. But a blue can be misleadingly light compared to a yellow. They could share about the same value. So if I do a real faithful rendering of this as it would show up in a black and white photograph, I lose a lot of what made the composition interesting with these pops of attention here that create a rhythm. So maybe, remember, drawing is lying, maybe I'll go ahead and tell a convincing lie and just leave the yellow white. Like it is, I know it's not white, I know it's got some value, but I want it to pop out. And so I'll leave it lighter. I want that blue to pop out. So I'll leave the blue like this, but do the yellow white. I could make that a little bit lighter and this a little bit darker so that this has that same sense of like really making his head pop out by having a light up against the dark there. There's no one exact way to do this. It's a bit up to you how you translate the colors over. So it's a problem of color and value that there's no 100% perfect solution to. It's just decisions that you're going to have to make as an artist. What lie am I trying to tell? What am I trying to get my drawing to do compositionally? And how do I have to manipulate the value to those ends? It could also mean that you purposely make the whole jacket lighter if you want. Whatever you need to do to make the composition more effective, it's up to you.